if Whitebeard hadn't been old, sick, and weakened during the Marineford War, but instead had arrived in his prime to rescue Ace? How would the story of One Piece have changed with one of the strongest men at full power? The Moby Dick, the pirate ship of the infamous Whitebeard pirates, was traveling through the Grand Line, but the crewmates weren't in the jolliest of moods. There was a clear tension in the air as news of Ace's capture reached Whitebeard's ears. Marco, Jozu, and Vista were among the commanders gathered as Whitebeard was coming up with a plan. They were surely going to go save Ace, no matter what the cost. But perhaps it wouldn't be wise just to brute force their way through Marine HQ. Whitebeard had faced the Marines for decades, but never had the stakes felt this dire. If they were to storm Marineford, they needed every advantage possible. Whitebeard smashed the arm of the chair he was sitting in. If only he were younger. If only he didn't have to deal with this blasted sickness. And then suddenly, something went off in Whitebeard's head. He had heard of a certain pirate among the worst generation, Jewelry Bonnie. She had a devil fruit that could manipulate the age of others. Could it be what he was looking for? Without hesitation, Whitebeard issued the command. Marco, ever loyal, took to the skies, his azure flames leaving a brilliant streak against the clouds as he sped toward the Sabouti archipelago. The island reeked of chaos. Smoke curled from shattered buildings, remnants of the recent marine onslaught still fresh in the air. The echoes of the fallen Straw Hat crew whispered through the battered streets, and tension gripped the civilians. The celestial dragons had been enraged, and their cries for order had tightened the Marines' stranglehold on the island. Patrols moved like shadows, scanning the broken landscape for any remaining rebels. Marco weaved through the destruction, his keen eyes searching for his target. His sources had led him to a secluded bar, far from the main avenues. Its wooden frame, worn and weathered, stood untouched amid the chaos. Inside, the dim glow of lanterns flickered against stained walls. The scent of ale and meat lingered in the stale air. There, seated at a corner table, Jewelry Bonnie lounged with an air of indifference, her plate still half full but quickly becoming emptier as she binged. She suddenly caught sight of Marco, and she realized that this wasn't an ordinary pirate. Marco approached Bonnie, and she quickly tried to flee. Marco gave chase and was quick to catch up to her. Marco introduced himself while she tried to fight him off, and as soon as he mentioned Whitebeard, Bonnie broke out in a cold sweat. Why was an emperor of the seas looking for her? The name carried weight, undeniable even to the most reckless of the new generation. Unfortunately, though, the two had made quite the ruckus, and Marines were heading in to check on what was happening. Without further explanation, Marco grabbed Bonnie and flew away with her, despite her protests. On the way, Marco explained that Whitebeard wanted to meet her and assured her that they harbored no ill will toward her. Rather, they needed some help. Bonnie learned about the situation with Ace and that the pirates had something in mind. She wondered if she had anything to gain from this. Marco soon reached the Moby Dick and landed with Bonnie, who was freaking out internally. And then she looked up to see the Emperor himself. Whitebeard sat there with medicines hooked up to him, and she met his gaze. Whitebeard was intimidating, to say the least. He was quite possibly the most intimidating man she had ever seen in her life, and she had seen an admiral fighting in Sabouti. She couldn't read Whitebeard's expression, but she held her breath as she waited for him to say something. Whitebeard told Bonnie to calm down before he got up and walked toward her. He saw that she was just a child, so he sat down in front of her with his legs folded to seem less intimidating. He then asked Bonnie if he could understand the extent of her devil fruit abilities. Bonnie was nervous, but she told him that she could manipulate age, reversing or accelerating a person's physical form. But the effect was temporary. The moment she was out of range, time would reclaim its original state. Whitebeard carefully listened to her while figuring out the best possible way to go about this. She was his only bet at regaining the strength he needed to fight at Marineford. But if the power only lasted a few minutes, then she'd have to remain close to him at all times to maintain any advantage. There was silence while Whitebeard gathered his thoughts. Bonnie herself was playing with her fingers, nervous and cursing herself for what she had gotten herself into. It looked like she'd be placing herself in a war, and she had no way of saying no. She couldn't possibly defy a Yonko. Whitebeard took a swig from his bottle and broke the tension for a moment. Bonnie looked Whitebeard up and down, and with a measured breath, she presented her terms. She said that if Whitebeard agreed to help her in the future, she would lend her power to his fight, and he would have to keep her safe. She might as well try to get something out of this. The words lingered in the salty air, and Bonnie instantly grew nervous, so she added a please. Whitebeard studied her for a moment before he laughed loudly. He told her that there was no one who could harm her if he regained his strength. With the deal all set, preparations for the war resumed with renewed urgency. The crew began sharpening their weapons, securing their armor, and ensuring their ship was battle-ready. The looming storm of war approached, and with it, the final march toward Marineford. Finally, the day of reckoning had arrived, and the entire fleet had gathered. Marineford was secured by and filled with Marines, but the pirates made their way using a route even they didn't expect. Underwater! 3 ships broke through right into the bay. As Whitebeard's fleet arrived, the Marines stood tense and at the ready. They were expecting war. On the deck of the Moby Dick, all of Whitebeard's commanders gathered before Whitebeard stepped up onto the stage. And as the legend took his first step forward, the world seemed to stop. He was no longer the aged, battle-worn warrior that the world had come to know. Gone was the heavy toll of time, replaced instead by the legendary monster of the past, the Whitebeard of his prime. His muscles, now thick and sculpted with unshaken strength, rippled beneath his coat. His frame was tall and unbreakable, and his golden hair fell to his shoulders. He stood as a testament to the power that had once rivaled the Pirate King himself. His once defense-lined face was now sharp, his youthful features burning with the same fire that had struck fear into the world decades ago. Bonnie was secured up on Whitebeard's massive shoulder. She looked absolutely tiny as she'd aged herself into a short old granny. The custom-made seat had been fastened onto Whitebeard's cape, and it made sure that Bonnie would be as close to Whitebeard as possible while covered in his hockey. Her heart could have burst from the stress of it all, and she tried to make herself as invisible as possible. Meanwhile, on the execution platform, Garp's fingers clenched into fists. He couldn't believe his eyes, and his head flooded with memories of the past. The Whitebeard that now stood before him was not the one they had planned for. This Whitebeard was the one who had created an entire crew of his own, a man who had rivaled Gol D. Roger in his power. He was known as the strongest man in the world. Memories of their brutal clashes flashed through his mind, the shockwaves of their battles, the ground splitting beneath their feet, the sky itself trembling under the weight of their hockey. His jaw tightened. Beside him, Sengoku's usually composed demeanor cracked. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what he was witnessing slamming into him like a tidal wave. He had faced Whitebeard countless times since they were in the same generation, and they had grown older at the same time as well. Whitebeard would have been a threat even when he was old and his body was failing him, but this was something entirely different. Sengoku then glanced at the bump on Whitebeard's shoulder. He suddenly realized that this was an ability of that tiny woman, and as long as she remained, Whitebeard would be the unstoppable force of legend. The three admirals, Sakazuki, Kizaru, and Kuzan, watched from their positions. They did know this wasn't going to be an easy fight in the first place, but they didn't expect Whitebeard to come looking like he was even younger than them. They did realize that things had gotten worse, but they couldn't possibly understand how strong this man really was in his prime. But they were going to learn pretty quick. Whitebeard smashed the air around him with his fists, and it cracked! A deafening tremor rippled through the battlefield as an unfathomable force exploded outward from Whitebeard. The waters rose, and actual tsunamis rose way above Marineford. The very island trembled as a monstrous wave of conquerors' hockey flooded Marineford, rolling over the battlefield like an unstoppable tsunami. Marines collapsed by the hundreds, their bodies hitting the ground before they even understood what had happened. The very ships in the harbor groaned as if the sea itself was submitting to the force of his will. The sky darkened, the air thickened, and for the first time in years, true terror gripped the hearts of those who had once thought Whitebeard's era was over. The battle had begun, and the world would soon witness the return of the strongest man alive. And then the battle officially began with a massive advantage for Whitebeard. Marineford was the headquarters of the Marines, a fortress built to withstand the greatest threats, but it was suddenly seeming more and more like a toy house. The ground cracked as Whitebeard's massive boots landed on the shore, the air around him thick with the raw pressure of his presence. The tremors of his conqueror's hockey still lingered, forcing even veteran Marines to steady themselves against the overwhelming force. Whitebeard smiled and launched himself forward while gripping his Bacento. He quickly closed the distance between him and the first line of Marines. They barely had time to react before he made a wide arched slash that sent everyone flying as if they were children. The ground beneath them shattered as he swung his blade, the shockwaves of his movements alone tearing through structures and soldiers alike. Marco soared through the sky next to Whitebeard, looking at the Marines as they made their advance. Sengoku, standing tall on the execution platform, shouted loudly, ordering his soldiers. He told them that they had to prioritize targeting Bonnie. The Marines adjusted their tactics immediately. Gunfire and cannon shots shifted away from the Whitebeard pirates, focusing instead on the tiny cloaked figure perched on Whitebeard's shoulder. The sudden change in priority didn't go unnoticed. Marco's eyes flickered with understanding as he moved instinctively, soaring above Whitebeard and deflecting the first volley of incoming attacks with a burst of phoenix flames. Whitebeard, unshaken, simply swung his Bacento downward. The sheer force of his strike sent a seismic wave roaring through the battlefield. The very earth beneath Marineford split open, consuming entire squads of Marines in a devastating fissure. The ocean itself responded to his power, great waves crashing violently against the harbor as though nature itself bowed to his might. Then Whitebeard sensed something approaching. There was a flash of steel before a slash came hurtling towards him. It was a blade of compressed air, refined and deadly, which carved through the battlefield with surgical precision, aimed directly at Whitebeard's chest. The attack had no warning, no buildup. It was clear who was aiming for Whitebeard. None other than the deadliest swordsman in the world could wield such power so effortlessly. Whitebeard's instincts flared. His grip on his Bacento tightened as he twisted his body slightly, bringing the weapon upward in a single fluid motion as he met the slash with his weapon. The shockwave from the impact sent ripples through the battlefield as Mihawk's attack was stopped and dispersed against Whitebeard's sheer strength. A smirk tugged at the corner of Whitebeard's lips. With a shift of his stance, he swung his Bacento again, this time unleashing his own attack. A monstrous slash of seismic energy carved through the air, roaring towards Mihawk with the fury of an unstoppable storm. It sent Marines flying, and Mihawk quickly raised his blade. He swung Yoru and met Whitebeard's attack head-on. The collision sent an explosion of force outward, the very sky above them parting as the two attacks clashed. Dust and debris swirled through the air as Mihawk held his ground, absorbing the force before lowering his blade slightly. His expression remained calm, but the message was clear. This was not a battle worth fighting. Mihawk took a step back and retreated from the unnecessary conflict. Whitebeard turned his attention back to the battle as he didn't have any time to waste. He didn't want Ace to spend a moment longer than he had to on that execution platform. The Marines kept trying to get to Bonnie, but the crew wasn't going to make it any easier for them. Every attempt that Whitebeard ignored was already handled by one of the commanders. Josu's diamond-hard body was tough enough to block slashes from the deadliest of swordsmen, so he wasn't about to let any stray attack get through him. He blocked cannon fire with his body and threw huge boulders at the Marines to stop their attempts at firing. Vista himself was an absolute beast as he cut through most of the opposition. Mihawk had already retreated, so there wasn't really any swordsman who could match him blow for blow. Each member of Whitebeard's crew fought with the fury of men who had everything to lose and even more to gain. But Whitebeard himself couldn't have been more of a beast. He truly showed the Marines why he was known as the strongest man in the world to this day. He would have been a force to be reckoned with even without the de-aging. But in his prime, he was absolutely ragdolling any Marine dumb enough to get in his way, even without using the Gura Gura no Mi. His presence was like an earthquake. The battlefield was a war zone that was trembling beneath the weight of Whitebeard's raw power. And then suddenly, the sky looked like it had split. Even Whitebeard looked up in amazement as what looked like captured pirates began falling from the sky. It was none other than Luffy and his band of makeshift criminals. Ace's jaw dropped when he saw his stupid younger brother falling into the battlefield, and then his heart began racing. Luffy was in the most dangerous place he could be in at the moment, all to save him. With a rubberized stretch, Luffy slingshotted himself forward, landing in the midst of battle. His arrival was nothing short of cataclysmic. Marines turned in alarm as he immediately started tearing through their ranks, fists and feet swinging with reckless abandon. Behind him, his impromptu crew of escaped prisoners stormed the battlefield, their presence turning an already chaotic war into further disarray. From his position atop the execution platform, Garp locked eyes on his grandson and clenched his fists. He had to end this and fast. The old Marine jumped from the execution platform and headed towards Whitebeard. Sengoku didn't waste any time either. He made a run towards Whitebeard alongside Garp, two legends going to face an old rival. Garp gathered his haki, while Sengoku began expanding into his golden Buddha transformation. His massive frame radiated power, golden skin glinting in the sunlight as he prepared for what was to come. Whitebeard had already decimated a huge number of Marine soldiers, and they couldn't even hold him for a second at a time. The destruction in his wake was immeasurable. Entire platoons of Marines had already been reduced to rubble under the sheer weight of his might, and now he was almost within reach of the execution platform. Garp knew that his fighting Whitebeard meant that he was delaying his adopted grandson from being rescued, but the man had no choice. His loyalty to the Marines was all he knew, but his heart wasn't moving along with his decision. Despite this, Garp took a step forward, and the air began to crackle around his fists. Whitebeard readied his Basento after seeing his old enemy in front of him. He yelled at Ace that he would only have to wait for a little bit as he charged his Basento with haki. Garp's Galaxy Impact clashed with Whitebeard's Advanced Conqueror's haki, and the impact was astounding. The shockwave alone caused the execution platform to break, along with the ground around the two. Garp took a fast step back as Sengoku switched over. His massive golden palm descended like a meteor toward Whitebeard, but the man simply lifted his hand up and stopped it. Bonnie had fled from Whitebeard's shoulder at this point and was clinging to the back of his neck for dear life. It was a good thing that Whitebeard's haki was protecting her from the blasts, as any normal person would have been crushed. Garp didn't wait though. He took advantage of the opening and launched himself forward with his fist coated in haki. Whitebeard saw this and pushed Sengoku's arm up before swinging his Basento, powered with the Gura Gura no Mi, and met the attack head on. The impact was earth-shattering, and even Whitebeard staggered. For the first time in this battle, he felt the sheer weight of Garp's strength. The monstrous force behind that single punch sent a tremor rippling through his body. The sound of the impact echoed across Marineford like a cannon blast, sending nearby fighters sprawling from the shockwave alone. But Whitebeard laughed and complimented Garp for still having some semblance of strength from his prime. It wouldn't be enough though. With a mighty roar, he drove his Basento into the ground and unleashed a quake-powered counterattack. The very atmosphere split apart, a colossal shockwave bursting outward in all directions. Garp and Sengoku braced themselves, their combined strength barely keeping them from being thrown back. Meanwhile, amidst the chaos, Luffy had somehow reached Ace as he was sent flying due to the collapse of the execution platform. He grabbed what looked like a key from Mr. 3 and unlocked the shackles on Ace's wrists. The tides of war had shifted once more. With the sea stone cuffs off of him, Ace was finally free. A surge of energy coursed through him, and his flames roared to life as he landed beside Luffy. He hugged his brother tightly before punching him in the head for doing something so dangerous. But there was no time to celebrate as Ace protected Luffy from another shockwave coming from the fight between Whitebeard, Garp, and Sengoku. Whitebeard, laughing with exhilaration, shouted for them to leave. He had been waiting for a fight like this for years, and now, standing against Sengoku and Garp in his prime, he was relishing every second of it. But Sakazuki had other plans for Ace. Like a molten specter of death, the Admiral surged forward, magma spilling from his fists, his burning hatred for pirates fueling every step. His arm morphed into a colossal, hellish fist as he went straight for Ace. Ace barely dodged in time as the magma singed his arm. It shocked him to find out that the magma was hurting him even in his Logia form. Sakazuki wasn't about to waste any time. Seeing that Ace might escape, he targeted Luffy, hoping to get one of the the two boys who had been a pain in his neck. Ace saw this and leaped forward, but Whitebeard was quicker. Breaking away from his fight, he blitzed towards Sakazuki with unimaginable speed. The ground shattered beneath his unrelenting charge, and before the Admiral's molten fist could touch either of the two brothers, Whitebeard's fist slammed into Sakazuki's face. Whitebeard arched his blow so that instead of being sent flying, Sakazuki would be driven into the ground. The entire battlefield shook because of Whitebeard's quake-powered punch. A cataclysmic force drove into Sakazuki's skull, and in an instant, his entire body was crushed into the earth beneath him. The magma around him dispersed like steam. Then came the second punch. Whitebeard raised his Basento high, gripping it with both hands, and with a single earth-shattering swing, he slammed it into Sakazuki. The entire island cracked at the blow. A massive fissure tore through Marineford, swallowing Sakazuki in a chasm of destruction. Buildings collapsed, the very foundation of Marineford split apart, and the ocean itself roared as tsunami waves crashed in response. Marco, Vista, Jozu, and the rest of his commanders immediately moved into action. They tore through the Marines who were still conscious and cut a path of escape for Ace and Luffy. Luffy hesitated for a moment, but Ace grabbed him by the arm and told him that they had to leave now. Whitebeard turned back to face his enemies one last time. Garp and Sengoku were rushing toward him, and this time Kuzan and Kizaru joined in as well. He cracked his knuckles as he stood in front of them. Kuzan struck first. A massive storm erupted from his hands that began to flash freeze everything in an instant. Whitebeard's entire left side began to freeze over, the ice climbing up his leg and encasing his chest in thick crystalline armor. But Whitebeard did not flinch. With a single flex of his muscles, the ice shattered. Before Kuzan could react, Whitebeard moved faster than the Admiral could perceive. His massive palm engulfed Kuzan's face, and with a violent quake-infused grip, he slammed the Admiral into the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through Marineford. The island couldn't take much more of this. It looked like half of it had already sunk into the seas, but Whitebeard had knocked Kuzan out with a single strike. Kizaru flickered into existence a moment later, his body shimmering with untouchable light. A barrage of laser beams rained down, each one a searing golden spear meant to pierce through even the strongest of foes. Whitebeard raised his Basento and with a swipe unleashed a shockwave that warped the very air. The beams bent mid-flight, redirected away from him, and exploded uselessly into the ruins of Marineford. Kizaru's eyes barely had time to widen before Whitebeard vanished. He reappeared in front of the Admiral, gripping his Basento with both hands, and in one colossal swing, he sent Kizaru hurtling like a meteor across the battlefield. The Admiral's golden body spiraled through the sky before crashing through Marine HQ's towering fortress. Two Admirals were down, but as Whitebeard turned back to Garp, Sengoku, darkness began enveloping his feet. His body suddenly began to phase as the effects of Bonnie's aging began to reverse. Whitebeard quickly jumped away as a dark, sinister laugh echoed through the ruins. Blackbeard had arrived, and behind him stood his entire crew, the most dangerous collection of monsters and criminals ever assembled. He strode forward, his grin widening as he saw Whitebeard still standing, his body facing the effects of Blackbeard's devil fruit. Bonnie barely managed to stabilize the effects of her own devil fruit, and it knocked the wind out of her. This was an extremely bad matchup. If Bonnie lost her ability, then the entire strain of the war would come hurtling back at Whitebeard as his body aged once more. And if that happened, he wouldn't be able to protect her. Whitebeard had decided. He grabbed Bonnie and threw her into the air while shouting for Marco. The Phoenix quickly swooped in and grabbed Bonnie. Whitebeard told him to hurry up and get her to safety. There was a silence as Whitebeard faced Blackbeard and his crew once more. He knew the effects of Bonnie's devil fruit wouldn't last much longer. He probably only had a few minutes before his body would revert, and he had to make sure that he didn't let Blackbeard's darkness get him before that. Whitebeard stood alone on the battlefield, the ground beneath his feet fractured beyond recognition. His breath came heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer exhilaration of battle. He had never felt this alive in decades. Garp and Sengoku had taken a step back to catch their breaths, while Blackbeard and his crew closed in on Whitebeard. He was laughing maniacally, thinking that this would be an easy win with his powers. But then Whitebeard charged. Blackbeard barely had time to react before a quake-powered fist pushed into his gut. The entire island trembled as Blackbeard's body was sent skidding across the battlefield like a rag doll. His crew immediately rushed forward, but Whitebeard was merciless. Burgess lunged at him, but one punch from Whitebeard caved in his chest. Lafitte tried to slip behind him, but Whitebeard swung his Basento, sending him crashing through the remains of Marineford. Van Augur took aim, and a bullet pierced Whitebeard's side. Shiryu took advantage of the opportunity to slice his side, but Whitebeard hit back with his Basento. He could feel the shift begin. Bonnie was gone, and his body began to revert. His youth was fading, the prime of his strength slipping from his grasp. His old wounds seeped open once again, but Whitebeard did not stop. He'd already taken out a few members of Blackbeard's crew when Blackbeard himself unleashed a black hole of gravity, the battlefield collapsing inward as pure darkness threatened to consume everything. Whitebeard looked towards his crew, his sons. They had made it to the ship. With a smile, he planted his Basento into the ground, and with a voice that shook the very heavens, he declared one final truth. He loudly exclaimed that the One Piece exists, and then he infused his fist with the remainder of his haki and power before plunging toward Blackbeard. A final world-ending quake erupted from Whitebeard's hands, piercing through the darkness and through Blackbeard himself. With a monstrous cry of pain, and Blackbeard's entire body was shattered. His chest caved in from the impact, blood spraying into the sky. The man with the ambition to become king, the one who'd betrayed Whitebeard and his crew, the man who had betrayed everything to seize power, was no more. Whitebeard had gotten revenge for Thatch. Finally, with his final breath, Whitebeard lifted both arms and slammed his fist into the ground. The island of Marineford collapsed. The very foundation of the Marines crumbled beneath the force of the greatest pirate to ever live. As the waves rose, as the battlefield was swallowed by the sea, as his vision began to fade, Whitebeard stood amidst the devastation, his body broken yet unyielding. He had given everything. His breath came slow, steady, as he surveyed the battlefield one last time. Marineford was in ruins as the Marines made their way to escape, but his family was safe. He had avenged Thatch and saved Ace, and now he simply wanted to rest. The once proud stronghold of the Marines had been reduced to rubble, buried beneath the weight of his final earthquake. The Marines had suffered unthinkable losses. Sakazuki had sunk to the depths of the ocean. Kizaru, the untouchable light, had been snuffed out, his broken form lost in the wreckage. Vice admirals littered the battlefield, their bodies sprawled across the ruins of Marineford, unconscious or worse. The Marines had lost. The Whitebeard pirates, however, had suffered minimal casualties. And most importantly, Ace was alive. As the tides began to pull the remnants of Marineford into the abyss, the Whitebeard pirates retreated. Their captain had fallen, but their legacy remained. Ace stood at the helm of Moby Dick's replacement, staring out at the sea. His mind burned with the memories of Marineford. The weight of Whitebeard's final words was still heavy on his soul. The One Piece exists, and his father had given his life to save him. He clenched his fists, determination surging through him. He would carry on his father's will. The world had changed, and the Marines were in the lowest state of power they had ever been. Now was the time for a new pirate king to arise, and so the race began anew. Make sure to subscribe and smash the like button for more One Piece videos.